Thank you so much. It's an honor. Can everybody hear me? Good. You know, I always wonder about that question. If you can't hear me, how would you know to say no? So anyway, I've just completed a book which is coming out on September 13th called The Well-Tempered City, and that's the basis of this talk. We know that the world is rapidly urbanizing. By 2080, more than 50% of by 2080, more than 80% of the world's population will be living in cities. And our cities, the global cities, and even many American cities are not really adapted to deal with this enormous potential growth. The population, by the way, at the same time will stabilize, we think, at about 10 billion people. And that has enormous demands on infrastructure, but also on the governance to be able to achieve that. At the same time, the population is dramatically increasing in economic status. We're having a larger and larger middle class, and that middle class is consuming more, which is putting enormous pressure on the world's resources. At the same time, we're seeing a dramatic growth in income inequality, and this is pervasive in every aspect of society, including the physical, where we see slums and luxury communities cheek by jowl. All of these forces are in a context in which the military calls VUCA, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We're seeing a much, much more volatile world. By the way, what happens is when you move from complicated systems to complex systems, the outcomes are uncertain. So the volatility means that you don't quite know how to solve the problems. So for example, in 2011, there were riots in London, completely unexpected. And this is the reason why. This is a map of London, and everywhere where you see a little Google dot, that's a place where a riot took place. The deeper the red in this map, the deeper the poverty. So what's interesting is if you look at it, the really poor places weren't the places that rioted. What rioted were actually the lower middle income places where there was an invisible line of opportunity in which people could not cross. And that pent up frustration is what gave place to that riot. And we're seeing that frustration all over the world. Another part of volatility is obviously financial volatility. We saw an enormous financial meltdown, and there's a threat that China, who many people feel numbers are not accurate, could also be the cause of the next financial meltdown. I mentioned that we are extracting resources irresponsibly and enormously to feed the growing demand of materialism, and that is leading to tremendous changes in both biodiversity and the climate. And the climate change is also being caused by our burning coal and other fossil fuels. And this is deeply, deeply unsustainable. Human development, we are part of life, we are part of nature, but the way we are going about the development of our urbanization is completely out of alignment with how nature functions. And we are developing in places simply we shouldn't be developing because of the huge pressures. And finally, what we're seeing is, and we see this every time throughout history, as populations densify and tensions rise and there's limited resources, is that racial tensions also rise along with that. And finally, there's a refugee crisis. We're seeing that today in the world there are 60 million refugees, many from wars, many from our climate refugees, and that is only increasing. This is in Syria, and we're seeing both devastation and migration. The migration is an amazing opportunity for cities to receive these wonderful immigrants who have so much aspiration and desire to build anew. That's how the United States was made. We are a country of refugees, a country of migrants, but it's also an enormous destabilizing force. So how do we deal with this? I actually gave my very first talk on this subject at CNU #1. And I have to thank Andres because I was not on the agenda. In the middle of the conference, I said, I have something I'm burning to say, and he put me on. And that talk was called Violence, Materialism, and Ritual, and ended up being published by the University of Virginia architecture magazine called Modulus. And that was the beginning of my thinking. It's been 24 years that I've been thinking about all these subjects that has led to the talk I'm giving you today. The framework is something called temperament. And it was expressed in this most extraordinary work, The Well-Tempered Clavier, which was written by Johannes Bach, and it was written in 1724. He actually wrote 2 books, so it was 24 and 44. It's an amazing work in which he set out the aspiration to encompass every note and every pattern and every harmony that was possible on the keyboard. The keyboard was a new technology, the clavier, so he had a new technology and he had a new system for how to write music, and he put those together with an aspiration to reflect the harmony of the universe on Earth through music. What had happened was that in about 2,000 years earlier, Pythagoras had said that he'd observed that the ratio between the notes was exactly the same as the ratio between the planets. He called it the harmony of the spheres, and that therefore everybody from then on tuned their instruments exactly that way. And what it allowed for was that you got these perfect scales, but the scales were slightly off with each other and you could never integrate them. So they were perfect in themselves but unconnectable. They sounded horrible when connected. And it wasn't until a Chinese scholar and then a German scholar discovered this idea of temperament, which is tuning slightly in between perfection, but what it allowed for was massive integration. And all of a sudden you could go from one key to another key, and you had this all of a sudden the clavier, this keyboard that you could do it upon, and the new technology, and it unleashed this incredible music. It could have never happened before. And to me, that is actually an idea that we need to take to how we think about cities. The world's first city, so I want to talk about the evolution of cities just very, very briefly. This is a archaeological site called Göbekli Tepe, which is in the southern Anatolian mountains in Turkey. This extraordinary site, I mean, there are pillars in this site that are, weigh 500 tons. They were carried by people from over 1,000 feet away and carved with fantastic images, etc. This huge spiritual site was actually built before the first village was built. Our evidence of this was built about 12,000 years ago, and the first evidence of any village that we actually have is about 10,000 years ago. So people were they were taking their building skills not for their own shelter, not to build cities in the beginning, but to actually try and mark where there was harmony between heaven and earth. This principle, and if you look at any ancient city, what you find all over the world, in any birthplace of culture, what you see underneath it was this vast attempt to create a map of the universe, just the way Bach did, and find the harmony between heaven and earth and map it in physical place and create a place that people could live in that harmony. And one of my senses is that is an aspiration that is lost from our city design today and is something that we need to return to. This is Hammurabi, and in 1754 BC, he created a code. And one of the things he said in his code is, when Marmaduke set me to rule over men, to give protection of right to the land. So he was saying people had a right to own their own land, and that needed to be protected by government. And righteousness, brought to bring about the well-being of the oppressed. The great gods have called me, blah, 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 that the strong may not injure the weak, in order to protect the widows and orphans, in order to bespeak justice in the land, to settle all disputes, to heal all injuries. I shall rule to further the well-being of mankind. This is also in the very, very DNA of cities. This amazing sense of the responsibility to further the well-being of all humankind, to protect the weak from the strong. This is another thing that we are seeing we have lost in our cities, but is in the very core, the very DNA of city making. Another thing, this is China, the magic square. So the Chinese system believed in harmony between heaven and earth, and they had this incredible way of mapping it called the 9-square system. So for example, a farm field looked like this. A large farm would be divided up. There'd be 8 squares, each given to a separate farmer, and they collectively farmed the 9th square, the center square, which was for the emperor. And all the produce of that went to a town, which was organized in the exact same plan, and the center square of the town was where the warehouse was, where all the farm produce for the emperor went, and so on up to the imperial city. And for example, in every case, the 1st square was the marketplace, the 5th square was a particular hall of governance, etc. The entire country was mapped on the exact same format, a very rigid system, but the whole goal was to maintain harmony, was to align harmony between heaven and earth. The Greeks, on the other hand, had a very different system. They really, a much lighter system. They believed in individualism, and what we get from the Greeks, by the way, is the idea of the atom. The atom is the idea that there is an individual particle, and we actually think of the self as an atom. that can make its own decisions, that is not dependent, but that everything can be reduced down to this, we're made of a collection of these individual things, but they're not so tied together, whereas in the Eastern system, they're completely tied together. My sense is that our cities actually have to draw from both these traditions and integrate them. Today, they are not integrated. These are some environmental impact statements. And typically, when we do a large project, we spend about $1 million creating these, and there may be some environmental impact statement makers in the audience, but I think it's a complete waste of money. And one of the reasons why is they have all these chapters, and they look at the issues related to the projects we're doing with a bunch of theory, not a bunch of actual on-the-ground facts, and they dissect them into these separate chapters, and they fail to integrate them. It is not a planning process, and yet it is the way that most of our projects are actually analyzed and approved. And it's something that it's an outdated technology, it's an outdated way of thinking. We also see that in zoning codes, etc. So we need to actually start with a holistic vision of what we want to achieve. I know there's some people from Portland here today, and the Portland Sustainability Institute came up with this fantastic vision for what they wanted their city to be. So if you look, you'll see, for example, transit. There's a bicycle, there are people walking, there's a bus, there's light rail, there's a green car. They say we want all these multiple modes of transit, we want them to work together. There's a green street, there's trees on the street and rainwater absorption. It says Oregon grown, there's local food from local farms, there's a beautiful park on the other side, there's higher density. For many cities, this is higher density. You'll see windmills on the top, which actually don't work very well, but they're there to symbolize the idea of a green building and green economy. So in this one image, the people of Portland set out and said, this is what we're aiming for. And I deeply believe that every community needs to start with a holistic village of how it hopes to find harmony between its people and nature, how it hopes to equalize the landscape of opportunity for all, and how you make that manifest, each in its own place. There's another thing that has evolved since the environmental impact stage, and this is sustainability indexes, health indexes. We now have ways of measuring multiple factors with real-time data and understanding what's going on in our cities. If you look at some of these numbers, it's greenhouse gas, energy use, production of green housing, traffic construction, student drug abuse, student dropout rates, basic needs shelter, the degree of volunteering in the community, parks and open space accessibility. Any community, what I believe is communities should begin by defining their values, what really matters, and then what data can we get that can indicate to us what those values are, and how can we measure those values, and how can we see how well we are doing towards achieving those values. And the goal of development, and obviously all the environmental ones like traffic and stuff should be in it, but we are entirely designing our communities and our approval processes often about a very few things, such as traffic or sales taxes, economic impact, and not about a holistic view of what really makes an extraordinary community and whether that project will move us closer or farther away from it. I take as a model something called biocomplexity, which is actually how nature works. So what's amazing, I don't know if you've read that humans have literally 50% of our genome is the same as a banana, and 92% is the same as a frog. Why is this? It's because you notice that when humans breathe in oxygen, and trees breathe out oxygen. We breathe out carbon dioxide, and trees breathe in carbon dioxide. This magnificent, extraordinary fitting together of life comes from the fact that we all share the same genome. That's what tunes us all together. That is the instruction code, the data system, the guidance system, the rules, the form-based code that is guiding us all to co-evolve together. Epigenetics is the feedback loop of that system. The protonome is the building blocks of that system. The metabolomics is the energy side of that system, and they are all in nature tied together, and we need to tie those together in our cities. And the way we need to do that is, as I described, we need to plan, and then cities have the tools of regulation, investment, incentives, and they can lead. You can apply those tools, you can measure the outcomes, you can compare to your community health indicators, and then you can modify and change the plan and keep that in an eternal loop. That's what coevolution truly is. And to me, that's what we need to do to evolve our cities towards wholeness. I want to talk to you about a circular economy. Remember I said we're going to be 10 billion people. and we're consuming too much, and we're becoming more prosperous, and we're destroying the environment. And in fact, we're also becoming hugely economically segregated. So one of the answers is to, again, follow the function of nature in a system called a circular economy. So we already have begun in our cities to collect our stormwater and to recycle it and to begin to use it. You can clean it up and use it as fresh water. We can begin to collect our organic waste. San Francisco has the most recycling of any city in the world. And it takes all of its organic waste, which is separated, composts it, uses it to feed the farms in Napa Valley, et cetera, fertilize those farms, and bring fresh food back into the city. We can do this with construction waste. We know we can demolish it, repurpose it, and turn it back into building blocks and construction material. The more today, 98% of all material that enters a city leaves 6 months later as waste. So the more that we can actually take that waste and recycle it, as Bill McDonough calls, waste becomes food. That is how we create a circular economy. And guess what that does? It not only reduces environmental impact, it creates an enormous number of jobs, and good local jobs. This is the wastewater treatment plant in Windhoek, Namibia. Namibia is a desert city. It's a place with enormous lack of water. It's a city that has been rapidly growing since the 1980s, and they were running out of water. And so what did they do? They created the first plant in the world, this is it, that takes their sewer water, cleans it perfectly, and brings it back into their drinking water system. This plant has run for over 40 years without ever having a failure. We don't like that idea because we're designed biologically not to like it, but the engineer who designed this said we need to respect water for its quality and not its history. And so this is Windhoek today. It's grown enormously because it's recycling its water. That's another one of the circular economies that we can do. The Blue Plains Water Treatment Plant, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., is beginning to do this, but it's doing another thing. It's beginning to separate out phosphorus and nitrogen. We have a huge fertilizer issue in the world, and our urine is filled with phosphorus and nitrogen, and it turns out you can spend $100 a ton to create $400 of product to sell. So sewage treatment plants are beginning to become resource plants. We know that we can capture all the methane in them and burn that and not only totally fuel the plant, but also fuel, and many treatment plants can now fuel 6,000 to 10,000 homes. They provide the energy for 6,000 to 10,000 homes nearby. And the next step, which is just emerging, is actually we're designing little like electric eel bacteria that, as they digest the sewage, just create electricity directly. You don't even have to burn anything. So as we begin to think of our waste as part of a whole system, not a linear system where it comes in and goes out, we can create local jobs, create the infrastructure our cities need. We can collect rainwater, and we can collect it. Now I want to talk about distributed systems, so they not all have to be central. So we can collect rainwater. We can do solar. This is the Bullitt Center in Seattle, where we're going to have our next CNU, an amazing building that creates more electricity, generates more water, et cetera, than it consumes. We can tie these together into microgrids. We also can use parks and open space. I'm going to move quickly because there's a very important point I want to make, and I only have a little bit of time left. So I want to get onto social networks. So in 1997, there was a heat wave in Chicago. More people die, about 10 times more people die from heat waves than die from hurricanes and tornadoes, as an issue of climate change to think about. And a scholar named Eric Kleinenberg did a map and looked, where did all the people die who died in Chicago? And as one would expect, the death rates were much higher in the poor black neighborhoods and much lower in the wealthy white neighborhoods. But there were two poor black neighborhoods that actually outperformed the white neighborhoods in terms of survival rates. And when he looked into it, the reason why was because of social networks. Because these communities had very strong social fabrics. They had church groups which checked on the elderly every day. They had food feeding systems so that nobody in there, even though their communities were poor, would starve. This social fabric was actually provided the resilience that allowed for those people to thrive. And this is a key part of our cities. Building social networks, supporting social resilience is an essence of sustainability. There's an idea called communities of opportunity. We know in the United States today that from the poorest zip code to the wealthiest, the worst life expand to the highest high lifespan, there is a 20-year difference. We know in England, in London, that every 2 stops on the subway system you go east, you live an average year of a life, 1 year less of life. So we know that opportunity and community are very, very place-based. We know that there's these several constituents. So affordable housing, education, healthcare, open space, neighborhood serving markets, access, transportation, jobs, that are key towards opportunity. And we can map those too and see how much our neighborhoods are in alignment or not. And we as city planners should be working to align our communities with opportunity. I deeply believe we have a moral responsibility. I deeply believe that the American promise is that the landscape of opportunity for all is equal. That we may do different things with that opportunity, but in America, there's no reason why one child goes to a great school and another one goes to a not great school. So where's the money going to come for this? These are the OECD countries. The blue line is how much we spend on healthcare, and the red line is how much those countries spend on social services, early pre-K, prenatal care, parental leave, affordable housing. And what you'll see is that the United States does not spend the most. We spend about the middle of the pack. But you'll see that we spend by far the most on healthcare, and all the other countries, which actually have much, much better health outcomes than we do, spend far more on all these other services. It's really, really clear that if we shifted our budget from spending so much money on CAT scans and moved it to spending much more money on affordable housing and early childhood education, we could be in social services, that the well-being of our people would be much better off. Our children are being exposed to something called toxic stress. And toxic stress, there's something called adverse childhood experiences. An adverse childhood experience is the experience of abuse, emotional, sexual, or physical, family dysfunction, neglect, parental fighting, domestic violence. When a child experiences 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, by the time they're 4 years old, it permanently rewires their brain. And it moves them into a flight-fight mode, and it has a whole series of health outcomes. So this we now know from the fantastic studies done by not only Kaiser, but many others, that such children as over life will have 236% more chance of arthritis, 231% of asthma, 157% of cancer, 200% more diabetes, etc. All these health outcomes. We also know there are social outcomes that because they are so afraid of a threat, they can't pay attention in school, they have much higher rates of ADD. We know that there's a whole series of psychological effects that come from this. So there is a disease that is permeating our culture, and the effects of toxic stress and the effects of abuse and neglect is rapidly growing within our culture. As I mentioned, it can actually lead to much lower lifespans, and this has a huge economic toll on our society. So for every group of 4-year-olds today, the lifetime cost will be $124 billion. And next year, the new group of 4-year-olds, the lifetime cost will be $124 billion. So the question to me is not only a moral question, it's an economic question, which is I simply believe it is not sustainable for us to not acknowledge that we have this huge endemic problem within our communities, often within our low-income communities, but rapidly rising in our suburban communities, and that we need to solve this. There are a bunch of solutions to this that we know. The brain needs to be rewired. And by the way, I call this problem our cognitive ecology. So just as we have a physical ecology, a natural ecology that we're dealing within, and what I call technical ecology, our cities are actually a technical ecology, there's also the mental ecology, a cognitive ecology. And we need to weave these three together. One is we actually know that meditation is a way of rewiring the brain. There's a lot of science now that shows us. We know that trauma is embodied, and so yoga can really make a difference. We know that cognitive behavioral therapy in combination with those is more effective. We know that social networks actually can be rebuilt. There's many, many things we need to do, but as a society, as community builders, as community designers, as city managers, we actually need to understand this invisible realm of toxicity and deal with it. So I'm going to skip this and go to this is New Orleans. This is the Lafitte Project, New Orleans. Many of you know what happened. CNU was deeply involved in New Orleans. Many people were involved in its rebuilding. This is a public housing project, hugely dysfunctional. The flood came, the flood left, and this is its rebuilding, built totally according to new urbanist principles. There's home ownership, it's much more mixed income, but here's what happened. This is the larger neighborhood. So before the flood, there was one hospital called Charity Hospital. It was a horrible hospital, and that's where all poor people went. Now in New Orleans, they didn't rebuild Charity Hospital. They built 88 community-based clinics. I already mentioned that this kind of population has very high diabetes levels. Those clinics, for example, are providing dialysis. They've trained local residents, some who never had a job in their life, to become dialysis operators. So when you begin to distribute systems, support systems into neighborhoods, you're creating distributed jobs and distributed opportunities. They brought the Whole Foods and people began to work there. They brought they distributed charter schools. There's a theater, there's a Head Start Center, there's a new elementary school, there's a beautiful greenway that they carved out in this neighborhood. So this whole neighborhood was rebuilt according to the many principles that you're talking about, but it was done with a commitment and compassion for the residents, and not just for the physical form, and not just for the environment, but weaving together also the cognitive ecology, the social life, the opportunity, the landscape of opportunity for the residents. So again, these residents are now working at Whole Foods, learning about healthy nutrition, too. This is one of the new schools, and see the computers that are in it. The question is, as a society, must we wait for horrendous disasters to destroy our cities before we rebuild them? Or can we actually reimagine an American approach in which we say banks, they're too big to fail. We actually have a policy about climate change disaster that's too big to fail. We don't fund it, we ignore it, and then when disaster happens, we step in and fund it. That is not a good way to run a country. And in fact, what we really need to do is to plan proactively, to develop a program of reinvesting in our cities, to taking all this knowledge we know about how to create social networks, circular economies, rebuild parks and open space, the new urbanist mixed-use, mixed-income design, and we need to begin applying that proactively to our cities now. I'm going to skip this. And I just want to end with this quote from Christopher Alexander, that making wholeness heals the maker. So in this act of rebuilding cities and rebuilding them in this way, rebuilding them based on two ideas. The first is that everything is interdependent. I want to go back to Bach. What Bach was drawing from was an incredible spiritual sense that the universe was all tied together, that every bit of piece was all of one whole fabric, and that was what he was trying to reveal in his work. And I deeply believe that is what we need to reveal in our work, the great sense of wholeness that we feel when we can really step back and think about our role in nature, and think about the magnificence of the universe and how it all ties together. And the second thing is compassion. That if you have a sense of that wholeness, and you infuse that wholeness with love and compassion, if you actually infuse every act into that system, it permeates, it spreads like pouring milk into water. And that is how we can heal our cities, and in that process, heal ourselves. Thank you.